In 1965, a Canadian working minimum wage could buy a house in 3 years, support a family of four on a single income, and save enough for retirement. In 2025, that same minimum wage worker can barely afford rent in a shared apartment, needs roommates to survive, and retirement savings are a fantasy. Here's the actual math. In 1965, Ontario's minimum wage was $1 per hour. That's $2,080 per year working full-time. The average house price in Toronto was $14,000. Working minimum wage, you could buy a house in 6.7 years of gross income. Today, Ontario minimum wage is $16.55 per hour. That's $34,424 per year. The average Toronto house is $1,100,000. That's 32 years of gross income. The gap isn't just bad, it's catastrophic. But the real story is what that dollar could actually buy. Not just housing, but food, transportation, education, everything. Minimum wage gave you a middle-class life. Today, it gives you poverty. This is exactly what you could afford in 1965 Canada on minimum wage. How the math actually worked, and why your grandparents could build wealth on entry-level wages while you can't afford groceries. In 1965, minimum wage bought you a house, not a fixer-upper in the middle of nowhere, an actual three-bedroom home in a major city. Let's run the real numbers because they're almost impossible to believe. Ontario minimum wage in 1965 was $1 per hour. Working 40 hours per week for 52 weeks equals 2,080 hours annually. That's $2,080 in gross annual income. No deductions existed for CPP or EI yet because those programs were just being created. You kept almost everything you earned. The average house price in Toronto in 1965 was $14,000. In Hamilton, it was $11,500. In Ottawa, it was $13,200. Even in Vancouver, which was already expensive, the average was $16,000. A minimum wage worker earning $2,080 per year could buy an average Toronto house with 6.7 years of gross income. But here's where it gets better. Banks in 1965 required 25% down payment. That's $3,500 on a $14,000 house. At $2,080 per year, saving that down payment would take less than 2 years if you saved 100% of your income. Realistically, if you saved 30% of your gross income, which was possible because rent was so cheap, you'd have your down payment in 5 years. Then the mortgage becomes affordable. A $10,500 mortgage at 6% interest over 25 years costs about $68 per month. Your gross monthly income at minimum wage was $173. The mortgage payment was 39% of gross income. High, but doable. And remember, you had no other major expenses eating your budget like we do today. Compare that to today. Ontario minimum wage is $16.55 per hour. That's $2,837 gross per month. The average Toronto house is $1,100,000. With 20% down, that's $220,000 saved and an $880,000 mortgage. At current rates around 5.5%, your monthly payment is roughly $5,300. That's 187% of your gross income. Mathematically impossible. You can't spend more than you earn. Housing has gone from affordable to impossible on minimum wage. But maybe you didn't want to buy immediately. Fine, let's look at renting in 1965 because that's where the gap becomes even more obvious. A one-bedroom apartment in downtown Toronto in 1965 rented for $85, $95 per month. Let's use $90. Your gross monthly minimum wage income was $173. Rent was 52% of gross income. But you had basically no other mandatory expenses. No internet, No car insurance mandates in most provinces, minimal taxes. Your real monthly expenses in 1965 looked like this. Rent for one-bedroom apartment, $90. Groceries for one person, about $30. Utilities included heating and electricity, maybe $8. Public transit pass, $10. That's $138 total. You're earning $173 gross. You have $35 left, which is 20% of your income, for savings and discretionary spending. That $35 per month in savings could actually build wealth. In 2 years, you'd save $840. That's 40% of the down payment on a house. In 5 years, you'd have $2,100 saved, 60% of a down payment. Minimum wage renting wasn't a trap. It was a temporary stage before homeownership. Now let's look at today. A one-bedroom apartment in Toronto averages $2,400 per month. Your gross monthly income at minimum wage is $2,837. Rent alone is 85% of gross income. Then add groceries, around $400 per month. Utilities, $120. $156. Cell phone, $80. Internet, $70. That's $3,226 in basic expenses. You're earning $2,837. You're $389 short every month. You can't save. You can't build wealth. You're going into debt just to survive. Food in 1965 was absurdly cheap. Not because wages were high, but because food was genuinely inexpensive relative to income. Let's compare actual grocery prices. A pound of ground beef in 1965 cost 40 cents. A dozen eggs cost 55 cents. A gallon of milk cost 44 cents. That's 26 minutes of work. A loaf of bread cost 22 cents. That's 13 minutes of work. White sugar, 5 pounds for 59 cents. That's 35 minutes of work for enough sugar to last weeks. Here's what a weekly grocery budget looked like. Working minimum wage, you'd spend about $7.8 per week on groceries for one person. That's 8 hours of work per week, or about 20% of your 40-hour work week. You worked 1 day per week to feed yourself for the entire week. Compare that to today. Ground beef is $8 per pound. At $16.55 per hour minimum wage, that's 29 minutes of work. Wait, that's actually similar to 1965, but here's where it breaks down. Eggs are $4.50 per dozen. That's 16 minutes of work. Milk is $6 per gallon. That's 22 minutes of work. Bread is $3.50. That's 13 minutes of work. The individual items seem similar in work time cost. But here's the catch. In 1965, those were your only major expenses. Housing was cheap. Transportation was cheap. You had disposable income. Today, after paying $2,400 rent, $156 transit, $80 phone, and $70 internet, you have almost nothing left. The grocery costs haven't changed much in work hours, but everything else has exploded, so you can't afford food anymore. Transportation in 1965 was shockingly affordable. A new 1965 Ford Falcon, which was the basic economy car, cost $2,200 at minimum wage of $2,080 per year. That's 1.06 years of gross income, or about 3 months of actual take-home pay if you saved aggressively. But most minimum wage workers bought used cars. A 3-year-old used car in decent condition cost $800, $1,000. That's 5 months of gross income, or realistically 3 months of saving if you were disciplined. You could work minimum wage, save for summer, and buy a used car by fall. Then gas cost nothing. In 1965, gasoline was 35 cents per gallon in Canada. At minimum wage of $1 per hour, that's 21 minutes of work per gallon. If you drove 200 miles per week and got 20 miles per gallon, you needed 10 gallons. That's $3.50 per week, or 3.5 hours of minimum wage work. Insurance was minimal. Car insurance in Ontario in 1965 cost roughly $150 per year for basic coverage. That's 5 to 7% of annual minimum wage income. Maintenance was cheap because cars were mechanically simple. You could fix most issues yourself with basic tools. Compare that to today. A new economy car costs $25,000, $30,000. At minimum wage of $34,424 per year gross. That's 0.87 years of gross income. Wait, that's actually better than 1965. But here's the problem. In 1965, you could afford the car because everything else was cheap. Today, you're already spending 85% of income on rent before you even think about a car. And gas destroys the budget. Gas today is $1.60 per liter, or about $6 per gallon. At minimum wage of $16.55 per hour, that's 22 minutes of work per gallon, actually comparable to 1965. But insurance is now $2,000, $3,000 per year, which is 6 to 9% of gross income. Same as 1965 in percentage terms. But when you're already broke from rent, that 6% is the difference between eating and not eating. Education in 1965 was basically free compared to today. University of Toronto tuition in 1965 was $575 per year. At minimum wage of $2,080 per year, that's 28% of annual income, or about 3 months of full-time work. But here's the key. Students didn't work during the school year. They worked summer jobs. A summer job in 1965 was 3 months. That's roughly 500 hours at minimum wage. Earning $500. Your tuition was $575. You'd need to work 1 additional month during the school year, working 15 hours per week for 20 weeks, earning another $300. Total annual work of 800 hours covering tuition plus some living expenses. Completely manageable. But most students lived at home. If you lived with your parents, that summer job covered your entire tuition plus textbooks and some social money. You could graduate university with zero debt working minimum wage summers. That's not an exaggeration. That's how it actually worked. Compare that to today. University of Toronto tuition is now $6,400 per year for Canadian residents. At minimum wage of $34,424 per year, that's 19% of annual income. Wait, that's actually a lower percentage than 1965. But here's where it falls apart. A summer job today is still 3 months. That's 500 hours at $16.55, earning $8,275 gross. After taxes, call it $7,000. That covers tuition with $600 left over. But you can't live at home anymore. So university students live in expensive cities near campus. Rent for student housing is $1,200, $1,500 per month. Over 8 months of school, that's $9,600, $12,000. Plus food, transit, poll books, and basic expenses. You're looking at $20,000 per year minimum. Your summer job earned $7,000. You're $13,000 short. That's why students today graduate with $30,000, $40,000 in debt, while 1965 students graduated debt-free. Canada introduced universal health care between 1966 to 1972, so 1965 was right at the transition. Some provinces had it, some didn't. But here's what's important. In 1965, healthcare costs, even before universal coverage, were manageable because medical care was simpler and cheaper. A doctor's visit in 1965 cost $1.57. That's 5 to 7 hours of minimum wage work. That's 1% of annual income. Catastrophic care was a problem. which is why universal health care was introduced, but routine care was affordable. But here's what really mattered in 1965. You didn't have mandatory costs that drain modern budgets. No cell phone bills, no internet, no streaming services, no subscription economy designed to extract small amounts continuously. Your expenses were housing, food, transportation, and occasional entertainment. A movie ticket cost $1, same as 1 hour of work. A nice dinner at a restaurant cost $3 for a full meal. 3 hours of work. A new television cost $400, which was 5 months of saving. So you didn't buy one unless you really wanted it. But you also didn't need it, because life wasn't organized around owning consumer electronics. Let's put this all together with actual monthly budgets. Minimum wage gross income was $173 per month. Your budget looked like this. Rent, $90. Groceries, $30. Utilities, $8. Transportation, $15. Basic expenses totaled $143. You had $30 left, which was 17% of gross income for savings and discretionary spending. That $30 per month was real money. You'd save $1,800. That's 51% of the down payment on an average house. In 10 years, you'd have $3,600 saved, which is more than the full down payment. Plus, you'd probably get raises above minimum wage. A minimum wage worker in 1965 could realistically buy a house within 10 years while supporting themselves independently. Now look at today. Minimum wage gross income is $2,837 per month. Rent, $2.40. Rent. Groceries, $400. Rento to. Utilities, $120. Transit, $150. Internet, $70. Basic expenses total $3,226. You're spending $389 more than you earn. There's nothing left to save. You're going into debt, just existing. Costs were fixed and income grew. Once you bought a house, your mortgage payments stayed the same while wages increased with inflation and experience. You built wealth through equity and wage growth. Today, costs grow faster than income. Rent increases every year. Food costs increase. Your wage increases by tiny amounts that never catch up. You're running on a treadmill that speeds up faster than you can run. The gap between 1965 and today isn't an accident. It's the result of specific policy choices, economic changes, and structural shifts that favored wealth concentration over broad prosperity. Housing became an investment asset instead of a place to live. In 1965, people bought houses to live in them. Prices reflected construction costs plus reasonable profit. Today, housing is treated as an investment vehicle. Prices reflect what investors will pay, not what workers can afford. Foreign investment, corporate ownership, and speculation have turned housing into a commodity.